So this morning our first talk is from Michael Wee. His talk is on euthanasia and assisted suicide, ethics and contemporary challenges. Michael Wee is Education and Research Officer of the Anscombe Bioethics Centre, an independent research institute based in Oxford. He is also Associate Lecturer in Bioethics at Oscott Seminary in Birmingham, and is a regular speaker in universities and schools across the country, across the UK. His writings appeared in the Public Discourse, the Catholic Herald, and the Church Life Journal. So, big round of applause for Michael.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Right, thank you very much. Everyone can hear me, it's a bit loud. Okay, if you can't hear me, just raise your hands. Okay, I think this should be fine. Thank you very much to Anthony, to Eden, and the whole team at SPUC for inviting me to speak on the not so cheery topic of euthanasia at 9:30 in the morning. So if you're not a morning person, I sympathise, because I'm not either. And I thought I should say, so as Eden mentioned, I'm Michael. I'm from the Anscombe Bioethics Centre. If you haven't noticed already, I'm not related to Udru, unlike some of you here who are more fortunate than I am. I thought I'll tell you a bit more about the Anscombe Centre before we dive straight in. So, can you hear me? Okay, I'll try to. So, is that better? So the Anscombe Centre is an independent research institute based in Oxford. We are, in effect, the National Catholic Bioethics Centre for the UK and Ireland. We were founded in 1977 by the English Catholic bishops, which makes us the oldest national bioethics centre in the UK. And a lot of the work that we do involves the academic side of things, of research, scholarship, and we also do public education. And obviously, I know not everyone here is Catholic or religious. In some ways, I will be speaking at least from a Catholic background or perspective, but hopefully not using arguments that will be inaccessible to everyone here. I should say that on the subject of euthanasia not being so cheery, and being a Catholic bioethicist in particular, we all know that, particularly those of us who are religious and who hold, positions as we do on pro-life matters, it's always an uphill task, isn't it? First of all, we've got to fend off people who say, oh no, you just believe that because you're religious. Right? And then on top of that, there's the perception of the Catholic Church or Christianity in general as just saying no to everything, right? And even Catholics sometimes, lend support to this impression. I have a friend who, when he was an undergraduate, one of the new encyclicals of the Pope came out, and he and his Catholic friends were gathered in a room, and one of their fellow Catholic students burst in and said, "Have you seen the Pope's new encyclical? It's great, it condemns everything." Okay, so that's the way people think about Catholic bioethics, and it's not a complete falsehood. Obviously, it's partially true. It's a truth, but it's a half truth, because there's so much else that pro-lifers, that Catholics, that all of us here who believe in a consistent life ethic say yes to. We don't just condemn everything. So I'm hopefully going to end off this talk, and you will hold me to this promise, I'm sure, with a bit of a positive note of hope. And I believe this applies to just about every single pro-life issue that all of us will encounter in our lives, in our work as pro-lifers, that it cannot just be no. We have to offer a positive message of hope as well. So today's topic, this morning's topic, euthanasia and assisted suicide. Oh yes, plug for the website, bioethics.org.uk. It's very easy to remember. So yes, euthanasia and assisted suicide. Now, I don't know, you might disagree with me, but I often get the sense, and maybe this is partly my own gut feel, partly from my interactions with fellow young pro-lifers, I'm also young, that yes, we focus a lot about abortion, and rightly so. I do believe our fight against abortion is one of the most important human rights challenges of our day, as John Deacon was very eloquently saying so last night. That's absolutely true, but somehow we're less well equipped, or even, dare I say, less interested in talking about euthanasia and assisted suicide. Last term in Oxford, where I'm based, I was giving a whole 8-week series of talks on Catholic bioethics, and we had lots of people coming for our talks. You know, the room was full when it was topics like abortion, contraception, even IVF, organ donation. We had more than 30 people come. On the day that it was euthanasia, it dropped to 15. Okay, so this room being full cheers me incredibly. But why is that? So it made me think why that might be. Is it because we think it's a long way off from where we are right now? That unless we've got some, you know, a relative in a care home or a hospice or somebody we know who's terminally ill, we might think that, well, this challenge is for another day. Well, all of us are at the age where we might know somebody who's pregnant, or who might even have had an abortion, or at least a crisis pregnancy. Euthanasia and assisted suicide seems like, you know, something for a different generation. Maybe because it's difficult to argue about, right? When we are confronted with the pro-abortion activist who says, my body, my rights, well, we can say, well, you can do what you want with your body, more or less, but the unborn child isn't your body. And that doesn't apply to euthanasia, doesn't apply to suicide, to assisted suicide. So maybe it's more difficult rhetorically for us to argue about, and that's why people shy away from the topic. Or maybe we think that there are no looming threats in the UK. I mean, we know in the last couple of weeks, the last couple of months, Parliament has become very good at saying no to the same thing over and over again. And that's sometimes quite a good thing, especially when it comes to euthanasia and assisted suicide. Whether it's a good thing or Brexit, I'm not going to comment. But when it comes to euthanasia and assisted suicide, well, we know that the Falconer Bill in the House of Lords was defeated over and over again in the House of Lords, although with smaller margins of victory each time. The Morris Bill in 2015, which was the last serious attempt in Westminster to push a bill forward for assisted dying, was defeated by over 200 votes in the House of Commons. So you might be tempted to think that, well, you know, this is really a fight for another day in all senses of the word. Well, let me just give you a sense of why all this might not be so. Is it really a long way off from where we are now as young people? Now, a couple of years ago, Public Health England did a big study on the leading causes of death, broken down by age and by gender in the UK. And it gave, among its findings, it said that, well, Brits are living longer than ever, but they're also in poorer health, which should raise some alarm bells for this topic. The leading cause of death for the elderly, was for those over 80, was dementia. Now, can anyone guess, for the age group from sort of above 10 up to 35, for both men and women, what is the biggest killer of young people in the UK? Suicide. Overwhelmingly so, for both men and women. Suicide is the biggest killer. So we're not just talking about, when it comes to, I know, assisted suicide, euthanasia, we think of that as something for old people, for the terminally ill. I mean, that's how it's often sold in countries where there's a push for it to be legalized. Don't forget, of course, just across the channel, really, Belgium has legalized child euthanasia. And we'll say a bit more about the impact of euthanasia on overall suicide rates later on. Now, you might have seen the news recently of the Royal College of Physicians holding what might be described as a rigged survey on assisted suicide. A couple of years ago, they polled their doctors, their doctor members. 58% or so said they were against assisted suicide. And so the Royal College of Physicians has had a traditional stance of opposition to assisted suicide. Indeed, I do believe, I haven't looked at the statistics, but probably, even if a majority of people in the UK might support some form of euthanasia or assisted suicide, doctors are far less likely to be supportive, in part because they know they're the ones who are going to have to do it, right? So, and now the Royal College of Physicians has put forward a new survey, not a yes or no, but a yes, no, or neutral, and they say they will only maintain their stance of being against assisted suicide if the no votes get over 60%. And that's clearly, people talk about the second referendum being rigged. This is what it means to rig a referendum, right? When you have not 2 but 3 votes and you demand. Basically, the upshot is that any group can then come in and say, well, are we sure we're against this? Let's have a poll, and you've got to have 60%, right? So that's what's happening at the moment, and I think there's going to be a court case to challenge the legality of this survey. Now, this is an interesting one. I don't know if you might, what you'll think of this. Now, since the Mental Capacity Act of 2005, I think it was, gives a legal framework by which you can make advanced decisions to withdraw or to refuse life-sustaining treatment. It would be legally binding. It would be valid as a legal document if certain conditions are met, which are spelt out by the law. And now, obviously, I'm not against, I'm sure most of you would not be against withdrawing life-sustaining treatment, at least in some circumstances, right? Now, if you Google advanced decision or advanced decision UK, most likely after the first 1 or 2 NHS websites, you'll get this charity called Compassion in Dying, giving you this resource pack on how to make an advanced decision. Now, I should say that Compassion in Dying is a sister organization of Dignity in Dying, one of the leading campaigning groups for assisted suicide in the UK. And I looked at their resource pack on advanced decisions, and while you can make advanced decisions in various different ways, you can say, well, in the event of such and such, I only want such and such treatment to be given, but not X, Y, Z. You can also fill in an advanced statement, which is not legally binding, but it's just it's a broader statement of your wishes, your beliefs, religious, philosophical, whatever it is. Now, the Compassion in Dying resource pack only gives you one way of doing things, which is I wish for all life-sustaining treatment to be withdrawn in the case of, and then you can tick dementia, brain death, this and that. All life-sustaining treatment, including, I should add, food and water, clinically assisted nutrition and hydration. Right? People talk about, the legitimate withdrawing treatment when the treatment becomes so burdensome that it's just, it's just morally difficult to carry on with such treatment. And when you withdraw the treatment, you can say you're letting nature take its course. You die from the underlying disease. That's not necessarily euthanasia. But when somebody removes food and water, even if it's clinically assisted, given by a feeding tube, the person doesn't die of the underlying disease. They die of starvation and dehydration. So that's what's happening. And of course, they will say, well, this has got nothing to do with our campaign for assisted suicide. But it's not difficult to join the dots, at least, and to see how this might then be interpreted as the law allowing some kind of covert euthanasia or assisted suicide anyway, and therefore we should have an open change. So that's what's going on. And I should say that, as I mentioned earlier on, they give you, so you can say, I wish all life-sustaining treatment to be withdrawn, and you can tick the conditions to which that will apply. And the first condition is, it's not brain injury or anything debilitating like that, it's dementia. And we know that dementia is not a disease that leaves you hooked up to machines ordinarily, right? So I strongly suspect what might go on in that case. I mean, a person who has dementia, in terms of ordinary medical needs, they don't need a ventilator. They don't need to have feeding tubes. So what it might mean is that if a person has dementia and then they contract, say, pneumonia or something, then the advanced decision might kick in to say, well, don't give them the medication for this. And that doesn't sound to me like a legitimate form of withdrawing medical treatment. So what's the paradigm case of euthanasia, of why euthanasia should be legalized from the point of view of campaigners and advocates? Now, the paradigm case goes like this. You've got somebody who is suffering unbearably or intolerably, as the language is often used. They're terminally ill. They're going to die anyway, quote unquote. Maybe they have a prognosis, or it could be a couple of days, weeks, or maybe 6 months. That's the gold standard for euthanasia campaigners. 6 months. They're going to die anyway. They're in great pain. If you give them a lethal dose and help them die painlessly, well, they were going to die anyway. So aren't you just helping them along in the natural process? Furthermore, you're going to save them days or weeks or months of needless suffering. That's the paradigm case, and of course put forward under the name of compassion. That sometimes people use the example of a soldier in a battlefield dying from a gunshot wound and there's no medic. But anyway, as far as modern medicine goes, this is the paradigm case of euthanasia, of why euthanasia should be legalized. And then, of course, they would say, well, furthermore, quite often doctors give pain relief, say morphine, opiates, which have the side effect of shortening life, of hastening death. Isn't that the same thing anyway as euthanasia? Or, as I've just mentioned, people do withdraw, say, chemotherapy or other forms of life-sustaining treatment, which invariably has the consequence, the side effect, at least, of leading towards their death. So isn't that the same thing anyway? Now that's the argument, the official argument in many circles for euthanasia. Now, some of you might have heard about the slippery slope of euthanasia. Now, in actual fact, there are two slippery slopes, because what we hear of the paradigm case so often then becomes, so it goes from unbearable suffering, they're going to die anyway. It goes very quickly from that to, well, it's all about my body, my rights, all about autonomy. They should be able to die whenever they want. Anyone should be able to have the right to die, so to speak. So there are really two slippery slopes in the context of euthanasia and assisted suicide. One is the first case, the paradigm case, where euthanasia is presented as a kind of medicine to alleviate suffering. Now, if euthanasia is medicine in that sense, where it's just another tool of alleviating suffering, like your painkillers, like sedatives, then logically, based on what is medical best practice at the moment, based on all kinds of professionally accepted best standards and practices in medicine, then euthanasia can also be done without the consent of the patient, because quite often doctors make decisions in emergency situations on behalf of the patient, or if the patient is unconscious, somebody else who has a lasting power of attorney can make decisions on their behalf. So why not euthanasia if it's a form of medicine just like any other? That is the logic. That is one of the two slippery slopes. And we see this already happening in Belgium, which has had euthanasia for over 15 years legalized in the country. So first, so we have the reported euthanasia figures, and people think that there are also lots of cases of euthanasia that are simply not reported in Belgium. Then you have this grey area, this twilight zone, called continuous sedation at the end of life. Now, sedation can be used legitimately at the end of life to help for pain relief in very, very serious pain, where it's not enough just to give painkillers. Sometimes helping the person, basically go to get some rest, fall asleep. That in itself could be a very, very powerful, quite drastic, but a powerful and effective and legitimate way of pain relief. Now, what happens quite often in Belgium, unlike in the UK, where sedatives are titrated proportionately to symptoms, what happens quite often in Belgium when people are approaching the end of life is that they're given a huge dose of sedatives, which makes them go into a very, very long period of unconsciousness during which they die. Perhaps, I'm not sure if it's from dehydration, if their fluids are removed, or simply from whatever else is happening in the dying process or in their illness. Now, a survey of doctors who have performed this showed that in fact there are some doctors, maybe about 15% or so, who in fact perform continuous sedation at the end of life with the intention to kill or shorten life. And in a small number of cases of overall sedation at the end of life in Belgium, this is done without the consent of the patient or even the family. It's hard to give exact numbers because these are not reported. This is euthanasia on the sly, as it were, but it's a real problem. So my wife is from Belgium, and we regularly have conversations with family and friends about these matters, which are very, very close to home. And one of the things my wife was reflecting on once was that one of the scary things is that sometimes when an elderly relative dies, you're not totally sure how they died. Because especially if they were unconscious in their final days, in their final weeks, and somebody else is making a decision on their behalf. What if somebody has 2 children, one of whom supports euthanasia and the other one doesn't, and the one who supports euthanasia was able to talk to the doctor first? These are very, very real issues facing people in Belgium. Dr. Peter Saunders, whom you saw in Uju's documentary last night, I heard him once when I heard him speak a couple of years ago. I remember him saying that in relation to abortion and euthanasia, that the generation that killed their children will now be killed by their children. And that's the horror of euthanasia. Now, what's the second slippery slope? Well, if on the other hand euthanasia is justified by autonomy, my body, my rights, my choice, then one has to face up to the logical consequence of this, that any restriction is fundamentally arbitrary. And so we see in Belgium, for example, though the Belgian law for euthanasia doesn't mention the word terminal at all. It's about unbearable suffering, including psychiatric suffering. So we have a rising proportion in Belgium from the first years until now of non-terminal illnesses being among those who request euthanasia, including psychiatric conditions. And in the Netherlands, there was a proposal a couple of years ago for euthanasia for those who feel their life is completed. Now, I have to say again, in relation to the to the challenge of youth suicides, that again, if euthanasia is about autonomy, then it embodies a fundamentally contradictory attitude towards death, towards suicide. Because I know of no country, I know of no one indeed, who doesn't see youth suicides as a problem. And if we do, then why don't we see elderly suicides, the suicides of the terminally ill, as a problem? So how do we respond with the remaining sort of half an hour I have for this talk? For the purpose of at least dividing up this talk, I'm going to suggest that we need 3 points, 3 areas of response to combat this challenge, not just before it happens, because it's already happening here in the UK, and some of you have come from afar, and it may be different in your country, perhaps worse, perhaps better. But I'm going to suggest that all of us, we need 3 points to be equipped in this challenge. One is to come to a more authentic understanding of freedom and autonomy. Secondly, to be able to distinguish between what is shortening life as a side effect, which happens quite often in palliative care, versus shortening life, hastening death, as an intention, a direct intention, some people say. That distinction, as we've just seen, is crucial to understanding why euthanasia is not the same as certain good practices in palliative medicine. And this is in some ways linked to the third point, although the third point stands on its own feet, which is that we must not let the other side corner the market on the language of dignity and compassion. And this is that note of hope that we need to give as well, that we have to show that the pro-life response is the truly compassionate one. And we have to have concrete ideas, concrete solutions, concrete responses of compassion. So the first theme of the 3, freedom and autonomy. What does freedom mean? Why is autonomy used so often to justify euthanasia? Now, if you've ever been to a kind of typical undergrad medical ethics class, or if you read a typical medical ethics textbook, you'll probably read that one of the most universally accepted, at least in the West, concepts of medical ethics, foundations of medical ethics, is something that's called the 4 principles, right? The 4 principles. Number 1, autonomy. So autonomy respecting the choices, the capacity of decision-making of the patient. Beneficence, only doing things that benefit the patient, weighing up the risks and costs of potential treatment versus their purported benefit, that's beneficence. Non-maleficence, basically not harming your patient. And justice, treating patients fairly, making sure resources are allocated justly. A friend of mine, I won't say which medical school he was in, said that his medical ethics teaching in his medical school was not quite up to par, shall we say. And on the first lecture on the 4 principles, the lecturer came in and told them about the principles of maleficence and non-beneficence. All right, that's not what we want. Okay, we want beneficence and non-maleficence. Now, of course, people might say, well, isn't euthanasia a contradiction of non-maleficence anyway? To which they respond, well, not if the person wanted it anyway. So autonomy is seen to be in conflict with non-maleficence, and many modern people, many doctors or patients would put the balance on the side of autonomy. And now, so I'm just going to say something about this modern conception of autonomy, and just to give a sense of, I mean, it might be a bit abstract, but just to give a sense of why it's so difficult in today's context to talk about a different conception of freedom, right? The modern conception of freedom is, well, I'll come to that in a bit, but let me ask you to take part in what they call a thought experiment. Trying to imagine a human being, just like all of us here, who has the normal powers of reason. They can reason intelligently. They have a will to choose things. They have free will, you might say. But crucially, they don't have the normal range of natural inclinations that we have. So all of us are inclined to things like food, relationships, love, projects of various kinds that fulfill our lives. Our sexuality inclines us towards certain activities as well. Now imagine somebody who had reason, more or less, and free will, but didn't have those natural inclinations. Now perhaps he could still choose to be good if somebody told him this was the way, if he read a manual of morality, if he found a moral exemplar, he would be able to say, okay, well that's the way I'm going to act, because that seems to be the good way, and I'm going to try to do it. He would be free to do so, but would he really be free in the truest sense of the word? We would say that he lacks a kind of interior freedom. Because what is his freedom for? I mean, he can choose. He has the power to choose between alternatives. But what's it for if there's nothing within him prompting him to choose this versus that? We often take for granted the fact that we don't exercise free will, autonomy, in a complete vacuum of human nature. No, actually our freedom, we take it for granted, but our freedom is based on those natural inclinations. Obviously we can still choose whether to act on them or not, but they provide us with a true starting point for so much of our free choices. And this is the difference. This is one of the key differences between freedom as was understood traditionally up until, say, the modern period, versus freedom as understood today, freedom as autonomous choice. And just to give a sense of the philosophical distinction, the earlier conception of freedom was freedom as something that came, as I said, from natural inclinations, but also from reason. Freedom is a capacity that can change, that can grow, that can develop. And we still recognize something of this. We have a concept called informed consent, isn't it? If you had the mere choice between alternatives, but you weren't properly informed about them, if you weren't mature enough to reason about them, that's not really free. So we still have some recognition of that. Now, the modern conception of freedom, on the other hand, which began with a chap called William of Ockham, the same guy who gave us Occam's razor, he thought that rather than freedom coming from reason, actually freedom is first, followed by reason. We have freedom first at the basis of who we are, and then we use reason to choose between things. And morality is something external. Now, this is all a bit technical, but let me just give you an easy way to remember it. So this is a priest called Father Servet Pincas. He was from Belgium. He was one of the greatest, I think, Christian ethicists of the last century. And in a book called The Sources of Christian Ethics, he wrote about this contrast between the freedom of indifference, which is the modern view of freedom, and the freedom of excellence. Freedom of indifference is that freedom which comes before reason. It's the freedom simply to choose between alternative paths, versus the freedom of excellence, where freedom is something that comes from reason. It's this capacity to choose based on who we are, and it's a freedom that is fulfilled in choosing the good. And he gives the example, a very real-life example of, say, learning to play the piano. Right? He says, well, anyone with fingers, with a hand, can go up to a piano and just, hit any key they want, and they would be free. I mean, it would be a kind of free choice in a very basic sense, in a very narrow sense of the term, to just hit any key you want, one at a time, 8 at a time. Who cares what noise you're making? But is that truly freedom compared with the one who subjects himself or herself to lots of discipline, to lots of training, to the point where they're able to play a whole Chopin concerto or something? That person is more truly free, right? Or learning a language. So we can all, if I don't speak French, I can all make sort of Frenchy sounding sounds, as people tend to do when they go on holiday. Well, not me, no. But if I don't take the time to learn the language, to subject myself to the rules of the language, which are man-made, I mean, language rules are quite often man-made, but if I don't subject myself to them in order to become fluent in that language, would I really be free? And so we see that the freedom of choice between alternatives is just one small part of freedom. And the true meaning of freedom is this wider sense of a freedom to be. It's not about a freedom to do, that has its role, but it's more fundamentally a freedom about who we want to be, what kind of activities we want to be able to be excellent in, and above all, in the moral life, what kind of person we want to be. How do we use our freedom? Now, you might say to that, oh, maybe freedom, this sounds as if, it's a kind of false freedom, that you are free to choose, but actually there's only one right answer. Is that really freedom? Well, that's not true at all. Because there are, for people like me, you might believe that there are obviously some absolute rules in morality, but apart from that, there are lots of things where there's no right or wrong answer, or situations where we have to choose between good and better, between good and good. We have to make all kinds of choices in life where the absolute rules of morality don't give a simple answer to. But what we need is a change in perspective in freedom and autonomy, which is that freedom is not merely an instrument to the good. If we look at all the good things in life that we aim for, that we enjoy, the good of relationships, shared projects, beliefs that we hold dearly to, that we will fight for, such as the pro-life cause, all of these are constituted in part by freedom. Right? I mean, marriage is a good thing, but it's not enough just to marry somebody. We want to choose freely, otherwise it's not a marriage at all. Right? Freedom is part and parcel, it's constitutive of all the goods of human life. It's not just an instrument by which we choose the good, and where, as I said, there's right and wrong and there's only one right answer. No, freedom is at the core of the goods that we choose. It's not mere sheer choice, as some people say. And yes, it's true, autonomy protects our bodily integrity, which is why even somebody who refuses treatment, perhaps for the wrong reasons, doesn't mean it gives us a right to invade their body with the medication that we think they need. Now, that's controversial, perhaps, but by and large, I think it holds true because we respect somebody's freedom, which protects their bodily integrity, but also because their freedom, their autonomy is grounded by their bodily integrity, right? Our bodily integrity gives us limits of where our freedom ends. It shows us the subject of our freedom. So once we see that link between freedom and the good, that we are free, not just to choose, but free to be the most excellent, the most flourishing human person that we are called to be, and that this freedom is at the heart of all the good things that we aim at in life, then we can see quite quickly that I think to use freedom to then extinguish one's own life is, in a word, a self-contradictory form of activity. Now, all rather abstract, you might say, but I'll just give at least one practical example of why freedom, autonomy, in the context of euthanasia can never be seen as a purely isolated choice, as so often it is thought. Now, there was probably 2 or 3 decades ago by now, there was an American legal scholar by the name of Richard Posner who hypothesized that if you legalized assisted suicide, you would actually bring down the suicide rate in your country or in your state. And his reasoning, and it's not entirely unconvincing, his reasoning was that, first of all, there are going to be some people who, statistically speaking, are going to commit suicide anyway. Now, if you ask me, that's a bad start for a suicide prevention program. But anyway, well, but hear him out. He says, well, statistically, we know there's going to be a certain group of people, we don't know who, but there's going to be a certain number of people in society who are going to commit suicide. If you make assisted suicide legal, which provides a sort of, it's a less grisly option, it's a cleaner way, a painless way of doing things, well, first of all, the people who would commit suicide anyway, so to speak, would simply do so in the clinical setting rather than by the traditional means. But furthermore, and this is the reduction bit, if they know this option is there, a clean, painless option, accessible more or less any time, then they might hold off their decision and reflect further. And that might lead to a decrease overall in the suicide rate. And the idea was that with adequate safeguards, I don't know how you do that, but with adequate safeguards, no one else would come into that category. So you're only targeting this mysterious people who would commit suicide anyway category. Now, there was a study done to test this effect just a couple of years ago by David Albert Jones, who's my boss. He didn't pay me to talk to you about this. And David Payton, whom you saw in the video last night. David Payton is an economist at the University of Nottingham. David Jones, my boss, he's a professor of bioethics at St Mary's, Twickenham. And so they did a study to test whether the Posner effect is actually true. Now, mind you, it was very, very difficult to test the effects of, say, legalizing euthanasia on the suicide rate. It's just like all those statistics you see about abortion and the crime rate. Well, you have to look at things in the context of, well, before you legalized assisted suicide, was the suicide rate rising or falling anyway? Were there any other factors like, say, a recession, drug use in the community, domestic violence, all the various things that might contribute to individual spikes in the suicide rate in that US state? Now the US nonetheless gives an interesting, it gives fertile ground for statistical analysis because you have states bordering each other where one has legalized assisted suicide and one hasn't, and culturally they're more or less, they might be quite similar compared with doing a study of, I know, England and the Netherlands or something like that. So anyway, they did a study of the effect of assisted suicide on the suicide rate in US states, controlling for those factors like the suicide rate as it was before, anyway, the trends, those individual factors. That's why you need an economist to do this kind of research. And their key finding was that legalizing assisted suicide in the US is associated with a 6.3% increase in the total suicide rate. And for the over 65 age group, the increase was 14.5%. So remember what we said about youth suicides. Euthanasia is not a challenge or a problem that is far off from where we are, either because of our age or because of the UK's legal situation. I should clarify, I should have done this at the start, that there's technically the difference between euthanasia and assisted suicide is that euthanasia is when the doctor or somebody else administers the lethal dose, and assisted suicide is when the patient themselves takes the dose. Okay, so that's just so, and in the US it's assisted suicide that's legalized, whereas in Belgium and the Netherlands it's euthanasia. Switzerland, it's assisted suicide. Now, Oregon, which was the first state to legalize assisted suicide in the US in 1997, now they provide data on various aspects of their assisted suicide practice, which also makes it a very valuable kind of living experiment, if you like, for people to see, well, in a word, the horrors of the assisted suicide regime in the US, in Oregon. And I'll show you more later on, but I thought one very interesting statistic. Now, Oregon, mind you, is often touted as a kind of gold standard model for assisted suicide. Like people say, well, if you look at the Belgians and the Dutch, that's really far off from what we want. The abuses there, potential abuses with the system are so great. I mean, you don't have to have a 6-month prognosis. The word terminally ill doesn't appear in the law. They have euthanasia for psychiatric patients in Belgium. Talking about Belgium, I don't know the Dutch law very well. Oregon, on the other hand, need to have a prognosis of 6 months, and there were additional safeguards, I'm sure. You might think it's more like the paradigm case of the person who's just suffering uncontrollably and they're going to die anyway. Well, in Oregon, they ask people who choose assisted suicide to tick the reasons that apply to them for making this choice. And they can tick more than one choice, as I'll show you later on. But one interesting one is that most of the statistics, most of the options have remained fairly consistent, but the one notable change has been the dramatic increase in those who tick being a burden on others. In the first 5-year period, it was 36.7%, and then it went on to 42, 44%, 63%, and the last year, it's not a 5-year period, but just last year's data, 2018, 63.6% in the course of 20 years, almost doubled in proportion. And mind, this is a proportion. Each year, more and more people in Oregon opt for assisted suicide. This shows you really the effect that assisted suicide has on the wider culture, on people's perceptions of each other, of themselves, which ties in with what we saw of the Jones and Payton study. Right? Some people call this suicide contagion. That suicide does spread socially. And the more and more people become exposed to friends and family members having made this choice, the more likely they are to consider it and perhaps even make that choice themselves, whether it's via the assisted suicide means or the traditional means, which is why there's an overall increase, and also internalize the perceptions that people hold in relation to their illness. Now, that was the longest 3, so the next 2 we'll hopefully breeze through. Side effects and intentions. I won't go into huge detail about this. This is Elizabeth Anscombe, after whom Bioethics Centre is named, and she famously said once, the denial of this, of the principle of double effect, has been the corruption of non-Catholic thought, and its abuse, the corruption of Catholic moral thought. Now, what did she mean by that? Now, the principle of double effect is, it doesn't tell you what the right answer is, but it's a tool of discovering what the right answer is. If you have a situation where you can perform something that has a good effect, but also a bad effect, in some situations, not all, in some, you could legitimately say, well, I'm only intending the good effect, like relieving pain using morphine at the end of life. And the bad effect, the side effect, the bad effect, you could say, well, this is a side effect. I'm not intending it, I foresee it, but it's a side effect. And I don't intend it. The principle of double effect, if it's a proportionate action to the situation, then it could be justified. Now, what Anscombe thought was that, well, for those who accept the principle, typically Catholics, but also many others as well, they abuse the principle by saying, well, it's just a matter of pick and choose which intentions you like. Okay, just like people were saying of Harry Truman. So she famously opposed Harry Truman getting an honorary degree from Oxford because he was the first president ever to use nuclear weapons. And people said, no, he just signed a form. He didn't really do the bombing himself. Now that's an abuse of the principle of double effect. On the other hand, the denial of the principle of double effect is to say that whatever happens in terms of side effects, there's no difference. It's all playing with words. Every effect, direct or side effect, is intended. There's no other way of going about it. So if you withdrew your chemotherapy because it was overly burdensome, you're intending death, you're suicidal, or this is euthanasia. And that, I think, it's not hard to see how that is really not consistent with the way we act. We don't just act as mere physical beings. We have a mind. We can determine action, intention, to some degree, not in all cases. If you're the president of the US and you sign an order for a nuclear attack, you're responsible. You're morally culpable as well. Now, in the context of English law, this is where it gets a bit complicated, because English law equates foresight with intention, which is a slightly strange way of thinking about things. I mean, last night I had to go and complete my slides for this talk. I didn't really want to stay for the quiz, but I thought, no, it's going to be a side effect that I foresee and welcome, but it's not my intention. I'm going to do my slides. That's my main intention. Okay, sincerely, apologies to. Now, or for example, there's real life cases. You're a bus driver, and there are perhaps elderly people standing in the bus, and you have to jam brake to prevent a collision, knowing with complete foresight that some of these people are going to fall over, maybe sustain minor injuries, but you can't surely have said that you intended that. I mean, yeah, maybe you're responsible in some way, but surely you didn't intend it. That's just a brief summary of principle of double effect. And that's one problem in English law. Foresight is included in intention. And then with the Bland case in 1993, we also have in English law an equation of food and water with medical treatment, which therefore can be withdrawn in the normal way as things like a ventilator or chemotherapy. And then we also have withdrawing life-sustaining treatment on the basis of quality of life judgments, as in the Bland case, as in the Alfie Evans case last year. Now, what we have to remember, first of all, is that food and water is basic care. Now, one of the problems with the Bland judgment of 1993, which was about a man called Tony Bland, who was in a persistent vegetative state. His family wanted his food and fluids to be removed because they didn't feel like this was the quality of life that should be. Well, I think that was their reason anyway. They didn't think that was how they wanted him to carry on being preserved in this vegetative state. And one of the judges, in allowing food and water to be withdrawn, he said, I kid you not, this is what one of the law lords said. Now, obviously, withdrawing food and water is for the purpose of ending life. There's clearly a guilty intention, mens rea, in the law, but because withdrawing food and water is an omission, not an act, there's a guilty mind, a guilty intention, but no guilty act. That's literally what one of the law lords said, which is bizarre because you can be prosecuted for murder by omission anyway. But of course, the judgment was then, was grounded really by a sense in which food and water is to be seen as medical treatment. And if the quality of life is not great, then that could be a grounds for withdrawing treatment. Now, since the Bland case, UK, English law at least, has in a way tried to reshape that mistake, I think, making clear that removing food and water could constitute homicide, and therefore food and water should be seen as something to be presumed. Nonetheless, so in that sense, people who use Bland to argue that, well, you see, the courts have already allowed a form of euthanasia, so why not we just bring it out in the open? That line of attack has now been quashed, I think, more effectively by recent developments in the law, particularly with last year's Y case in the Supreme Court. Nonetheless, there's still a different kind of attack on the dignity of life, which is of quality of life arguments. I'll go through this very quickly. Both Alfie Evans last year and Tony Bland, their court cases were decided on the basis of quality of life arguments. The judge in the Alfie Evans case quoted the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health guidance saying that you can remove treatment when, this is the point C, when the severity of the child's condition is such that it is difficult or impossible to derive benefit from continued life. And echoing the Bland judgment that existence in a vegetative state is regarded as not being a benefit. This is a very different way of looking at life from how we ought to. It's a sense in which life is something that we own, like a possession. Sometimes we derive benefit from it, sometimes we don't. And when we don't, it's not worth living anymore. Now, it's blindingly obvious why one of the first groups in society always to galvanize against assisted suicide or euthanasia are the disabled, because they see that this opens the door, judgments like this or euthanasia legislation opens the door for their lives to be deemed as difficult or impossible to derive continued benefit from. Nonetheless, it is also, and this is my personal note of caution, it's not always helpful when we look at, say, the Alfie Evans case, as some people did last year, to say, oh, this is clearly state-sponsored euthanasia. Because unless we have a really good reason to assert that, not just to suspect it, but to assert it, if we make such an assertion, we play into the hands of the other side. Because then they say, you see, you admit it, the state has committed an act of euthanasia. So we need to be very clear what the problem is. I'm not saying this isn't a problem, but it's a problem not of a direct intention to kill. It's a problem of not valuing life as an intrinsic good, of not fully appreciating that continued life in itself is always a good. It's not just about, a lot of medics think of futility as when, say, the ventilation or the therapy is no longer curing or targeting the underlying disease. Now, it's true, of course, ventilation wasn't curing Alfie Evans of his disease. In that sense, it was futile, in a very narrow sense. And that's why people thought it was optional. It could be removed. And that's wrong, but it's not euthanasia. But what they do need to know is that life, continuing life in itself, is still always a good. Doesn't mean you can't remove ventilators in some situations when the burdens are greater than the benefits. But it's just to say that we must be careful about calling such cases euthanasia. And personally, I don't think the Alfie Evans case was so clear-cut as euthanasia. It was wrong for many other reasons, but I don't think it was euthanasia. Finally, compassion. Now, I mentioned Oregon earlier. Now, Oregon, you might think with the 6-month prognosis, which means mostly terminally ill or coming to opt for assisted suicide. You might think, again, it's the kind of place where it's that paradigm case of people who are suffering unbearably, they're going to die anyway. What are the most popular reasons for choosing assisted suicide in Oregon? Pain control. Inadequate pain control is only 31% in 2018, and overall about 30%. And as I mentioned, most of these have remained consistent apart from being a burden on others. By far, the greatest reason is, the most popular reason, I should say, is the loss of autonomy, 95% last year. In fact, second greatest. Less able to engage in enjoyable activities, 95.6%. Perceived loss of dignity, 79%. These are the reasons, the real reasons why people choose assisted suicide in a place like Oregon, which already is supposed to be better than Belgium, more safeguards, it's a more tightly written system. Which brings us back to that question of autonomy, but from a more practical point of view. Because it must strike us, surely, that this view, this vision of autonomy as a reason for opting for assisted suicide, as a justification for the law, it must surely strike us as a rather lonely view of autonomy. Over the channel in Belgium, their law says unbearable suffering, la souffrance insupportable. What does it mean? What does unbearable suffering really mean? In the context of euthanasia advocates, it seems like a very individualistic, private choice. My body, my pain. I can decide whether my suffering is unbearable or not. It's completely, as far as their legal criteria go, it's a completely private and uncheckable criteria. What does it mean to really bear suffering? So often we find that bearing suffering is not simply a factor of our individual strength, our individual resources, but it's a factor of the solidarity and the help of others around us. We never bear the worst kinds of suffering on our own. Suffering, what it means to bear suffering, is so often the help that we receive from others. Right? We can't just have a kind of my way or the highway attitude, my way or the motorway, to say, in this country. It's mean to bear suffering. It's about others. It's not this lonely view of autonomy. So we must not let autonomy become abandonment. Because what happens in all kinds of cases, whether it's the paradigm case or people choosing euthanasia or assisted suicide for other reasons, what really is the logic of euthanasia and assisted suicide is that it validates the person in their negativity. It's not offering them a way out and saying, yeah, you feel that you've lost your autonomy, your enjoyable activities, fine, we validate you in that. And the most important answer to the question of euthanasia is not a philosophical one. It's a practical one of helping others bear suffering. If people find they have lost their autonomy, we help them regain it. It's a common transition when you go on into the last years of your life. If people feel that they have lost enjoyable activities, the onus is on the community, on us, to help them find new enjoyable activities. One of the most rewarding talks I've ever attended in my time as a bioethicist was a talk on dementia care and spirituality. Now, I don't have much personal experience with dementia, but the speaker was saying that was giving various practical examples of helping people with dementia flourish, have a good quality of life, give them things like a spiritual memory box, because their deep-seated memories are still present, even if their short-term memory isn't so intact anymore. And I thought that was such a wonderful testimony of how you can still exercise autonomy and flourishing, but in the context of your dementia, of your limitations. So remember that the fight against euthanasia, we can have all the arguments, but fundamentally what it is about our creativity, our imagination, to help people find different pathways out of their negativity, not to validate them in their negativity. And I think this picture for me sums up, in the sense, what that attitude should be. True compassion towards those who are suffering. So, thank you very much.